So as I mentioned, and I actually put this in the unit note guide and review, this documentary does such a good job talking about population growth, demography, worldwide averages and trends, that if you watched this hour-long documentary, which is actually very well put together, lots of good infographics to explain complex data, you don't actually even need to read chapter 11 in the textbook. This documentary and this corresponding question sheet summarizes that content very, very well. So a big portion of today is going to be us as a class taking this up. Now, I realize that I am recording, but again, none of your webcams are on, so that's fine. Nobody's face is making it into the video. This is a conversation. Okay, this is not a lecture from me. You have the answers, at least you should. If you missed a couple, that's fine, but I want this to be an audience participation activity where we're building this note together to ensure that the answers that you have written down are accurate, and also to ensure that if there was some that you weren't quite sure, that you're able to double check the notes that you have. So you should be filling it in and also using the answers that you have filled in to share, so we can walk our way through this together. So again, now I will say this as a bit of a disclaimer. At the time that the video came out, the video is several years old, and one of the important things we actually learned from the video is that numbers and data can change over time. That's the thing about numbers and data. They can be accurate, but they may be accurate based on a certain period of time. And that's why, as the old saying goes, records are made to be broken. If you go back into, especially the 1960s and 70s, and actually a lot of the music that I like, there was a time when the music that I listened to, and at least some of it, was at the top of the Billboard charts. That is no longer the case. So although you might be able to find an article that talks about Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass being in the top 100 of the Billboard charts, those would be archived older publications, and it is not up to date. Because again, things can change over time. So it's important to make sure that you're continually looking at data to ensure that you still have an accurate picture of how things are. Now, the good news is, even though this is a few years old, because they're also looking at projections for the future, it is still a very relevant and useful guide for us. And I was actually speaking to another geography teacher saying that I actually hope that, especially now with looking at COVID and looking back at the pandemic, it'll be interesting to see how much of that data has been altered or changed, and to see, because we'll have the data and the numbers, to see how this pandemic, the year of 2020 and and beyond, how it impacted some of these trends. So hopefully they will re-record and create an update video. But as of the time that the video came out, in rounded numbers, approximately how many people live on the Earth today?
7.9 billion.
7.9?
That's what I have.
Do we have confirmation?
I got that too.
Okay. And again, what's interesting is that if you watch the video, again, a few years ago, at the time that the video came out, what was the number that he gave? Approximately how many people who live on the Earth?
7 billion.
So again, this can show you how just in a short amount of time, we go from the data taken from the video, a world of roughly 7 billion, we are now closer to the 8 billion mark. Now, that shouldn't really take us by surprise looking at the numbers that we have seen. We'll talk about that curve of growth and how, although at one point it was exponential, how it is projected to mellow out and actually eventually flatten. And we'll talk about, again, what those numbers mean as we work our way through. Answers may vary in this one. What is the good news that Hans Rosling is suggesting? He says it kind of right at the beginning.
Humanity is doing better and the future might not be as bad as we actually think.
Yeah, in short, things aren't as bad as you think. And this is actually important news to hear because, and I think it's important that we spend time, in chapel talking about things like hope and talking about things like gratitude. Because I actually don't suggest, quite frankly, that you watch a lot of the news. You might say, what if I want to be informed? Again, the thing we got to be careful with is sometimes the more time you spend online, the more time you spend watching the news, it can sort of just seem like negative story after negative story after negative story. And it can actually get you into a mindset in which you think, oh my goodness, we're all doomed. Like the end of the world is upon us and it's just going to be a dystopian future, like something out of RoboCop or Fallout or, Mad Max, these dystopian type, again, all of these references are a little bit older. So you might be like, what is he talking about? But the good news is that although there are going to be great challenges, we have the tools and the capacity to be able to plan for success. So this is very good news. So again, going back to the data, again, we couldn't count everybody, but approximately speaking, according to the documentary, how many people lived on Earth in the year 10,000 BC? If we look at really the dawn of human civilization as we know it.
10 million.
So again, we're talking worldwide. So I know we talk about the world, seeming, especially like in places like Canada, where we have, a very widespread, there's so many places in Canada that it feels like there's hardly anybody there. And we're a country of, 30 million, 30, closer to 37 million. So if you picture not just Canada, but the entire world, there being only 10 million people, that's a lot of space. Now, that jumps significantly over, and again, we look at the time frame. Remember how you have to count with BC. And again, depending on how you look at, sometimes they'll use the term BCE and CE. BC traditionally was known as before Christ, and then AD was Anno Domini, which is in the year of our Lord. It's the way in which we sort of look at, we actually using, Christ and his, coming to earth as sort of the central point of this timeline. The way that we look at BC, at 10,000 BC, what comes after that is actually then 9,999. And it's like a countdown, right? So 10,000, then 9,000, 8,000, 7,000, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then finally gets to 0. And then from 0, we then move in the direction where we're going. So the reason why we say the year is 2021 AD or CE means that since the birth of Christ, 2021 years have elapsed, right? So that's when, again, we're looking at how we measure that. So we know that you go basically 10, almost 11, well, over 11,000 years in human history to get to 1800 AD. What milestone number does this give us? How many people lived on Earth in 1800 AD, according to the video?
1 billion.
1 billion. So we see this incredible amount of time that has passed to finally get to 1 billion people. But then what's crazy is that by the time we get to the year 1900, so only 100 years later, what's the population basically in 1900?
Wasn't it about 2 billion?
So yeah, this is where we talk about an exponential growth curve. You know, it took us over 10,000 years to go from, 10 million people to 1 billion. But then once we got there, it only really took us an extra 100 years to double and make it 2 billion. And that trend actually continued. What has happened to the Earth's population since Hans Rosling was born? You don't have to know the exact year that he was born, but he made mention of, if we're looking at population growth and the worldwide number of people, what happened to the world's population in the short amount of time that had elapsed since he was born?
Didn't he say, I don't quite remember exactly, but, or sorry, yeah. I think I wrote down, didn't he say it like doubled, more than doubled?
Yeah. He's saying, so in the time that he was not, an old man when this was recorded. I believe, he is, getting into his 60s, but at the same time, he's saying that in that time period that he had been on the earth, the world's population had more than doubled. And what continent has seen the greatest population growth in the past 200 years? Continent, not country.
Asia.
Yeah, I remember, and this was blowing my mind early on in my teaching career, and you can actually see the pictures. I'll try to find one. I think I've shared it with you. It was a Mercator map of the world, but then they basically drew a circle that encompassed, India, China, and some countries that were in, South Asia. And they basically said there's more people inside this circle than there are outside of it. And that picture always stuck with me. I never really thought about just the sheer volume of people in that, relatively small area. And by the way, it doesn't mean that even with nations like India and China that have massive populations, you can still find areas where there are very small villages and hardly any people at all. So we're going to talk about the movement of people and where they're settling and how they're settling. That becomes a big part of this unit. In the past few years, what has been happening in Bangladesh concerning family size? So this is really looking at over especially the last 50 years.
Wasn't it like the amount of children per couple?
Sorry, someone's talking, but your mic is very, very low. Try that again.
Wasn't it like the amount of childbirths per couple has gone down?
Babies, well, my voice cracked there. Babies per woman has reduced significantly. Oh, here come the allergies. Am I going to sneeze? Oh, I thought I was going to. Oh, that's the worst. When you actually think you're going to have a sneeze and then it's gone. But yeah, babies per woman has reduced significantly. Now, what were some of the reasons that were given for why this has happened? Again, there isn't one reason in particular, but there were kind of several that were given. What were some of the reasons that were given for why this, or what's known as fertility rate?
Wasn't one of them like more education?
Yep, that was one. Increased education. Anything else?
Like
I don't know if
increased
this falls
access?
under.
Oh, you go.
I don't know if this falls under the education category, but they made like government planning services that would send women door to door in their village or town to like talk to women about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And so there was increased government services that both in the means of contraception and in education, going their way, checking on people, letting them know about information for, family planning, and again, letting them know about alternatives and options for women that exist outside of, just having children. And this is something that we're going to talk about, and that the video talked about as well. We see the hopes and dreams that the young girls in that family had, to want to, potentially be a doctor someday. And, it's not saying that they don't ever want to have a family, but it's saying that they are having dreams of careers and ambitions that go beyond just traditionally maybe what their mothers or their grandmothers might not have even had the choice, where it would just be, for a lot of women across the world for a very long time, basically you didn't get an education, you didn't get to go to school, there wasn't even the choice for it. So these are two of the biggest reasons: increased education and healthcare access. What was the fertility rate in 1972? Again, you don't need to memorize this for the unit test, but it is important to look at some worldwide trends. I want to make some connections here. So the fertility rate, again, is basically saying babies born per woman in 1972. Again, what was the number that was given?
It was 7.
And that's the average. Okay, back in 1972, which I know seems like ancient history, and I mean it is. I mean it's older than me, but the average family size, or at least babies born per woman, at that time was 7. And that means, like, remember, there would be some women that didn't have any, which means that if you're doing this average, some families were even larger. So average babies born per woman was 7. What was the life expectancy in 1972?
50 years old.
And again, when we talk about average life expectancy, this is something that we actually, when we look at being grateful and being hopeful, I realize things happen and there are tragedies that happen, and maybe you have experienced loss of a family member, maybe somebody that you knew, during the pandemic. We want to be sensitive to that. But on average, when we hear about people passing away, usually, especially related to things like, old age, we often think into the, into the 80s and into the 90s. The idea of the average person only living around 50 years, the idea of a 25-year-old being middle-aged, that just blows our minds. Like, now, if people were to die in their 50s, we would look at it as extremely tragic. Whereas back in 1972 in Bangladesh, that was kind of the average. Now, again, it doesn't mean that you didn't have people that would, be in their 70s and 80s. But what this also would represent, when we look at the average, is that many, many children, the infant mortality rate was really high. So it doesn't mean that no one ever lived past 50. It just meant you actually had a great number of children that were born that wouldn't grow to adulthood. They would actually die as young children, and sometimes die as babies. Very, very tragic stories. They even said in the story, with the family graveyard there, one of the reasons why they kept having kids was because you knew that not all of them were going to make it. And that was the reality for generations past, right? If you talk to your parents and you talk to your grandparents, if you still have your grandparents still alive, if you talk to them and ask them, hey, did you ever have, a family member, like a brother or sister, die? You'd be surprised at the amount of them that would probably say, yeah, I come from a family of 8 or 10, and I had a brother who died of this disease, and I had a sister who died as an infant. And you'd be surprised. You'd hear all of these terrible stories that often we're shielded from, because of how much better the technology and healthcare services have been for us, within the last generation. So again, what's the fertility rate in Bangladesh today? The average baby's
2.2.
Sorry?
2.2.
2.2. And I know you might look at that and be like, well, why is it point anything? Like you can't have like half of a baby. It doesn't make any sense. Again, this is just the raw numbers, but this is a huge decrease, okay? From 7 to 2, basically. So you're right, 2.2 is the number, but we've gone on average, the average family size, the average babies born per woman from 7 to 2. That is a massive reduction. And now here's what's interesting as well. What is the life expectancy today?
70 years old.
So this is, and I want to highlight this because as far as us looking at the unit test in particular, some of these numbers, the 7 and the 2 and all that sort of thing, I'm not all that concerned about a lot of that. I do really care about this connection.
So
Let's
yeah,
spend some
so
time. Yeah,
basically,
go ahead. What's the connection between these statistics? What do
Yeah.
we see?
So the life expectancy has gone up due to people having less children.
And I totally agree with you. Can we give some reasons or rationale why we're seeing this connection? Is it random? Is
No,
it
it's
like,
I mean like when people have less children, for like it could affect their like mental health as well. Like because the larger the family size, the more people to take care of and like more financial struggles as well as like, you know, yeah, just, so that's why it could help.
so, and this is one of the saddest statistics that we're going to be talking about when we look at extreme poverty and why it can actually be very, very hard to tackle. Because in many parts of the world where extreme poverty does still exist, and Hans Rosling talks about this, the lack of access to education, the lack of access to healthcare, the lack of access to opportunities means that sometimes it's the people who are the poorest that are actually having the most children. So they didn't have enough to feed, themselves, let alone a big family. And so often what we see is that when family sizes were bigger, there was less to go around in the way of, having enough, literally like calories to have you grow and develop and to increase your immune system and to give you a fighting chance against, diseases that exist in the world. And by the way, it's not about being greedy, okay? I'm not saying that people have to be like, well, I'm not going to have any kids because then there won't be enough, food to eat in the world. That's not what I'm saying at all. Okay, we have an abundance of supply of resources. But what we are finding is that smaller family size has helped to eliminate a lot of extreme poverty that often increases, child mortality, has led to better conditions that allow children to live longer, healthier lives. So again, it is interesting that we see, and we have the numbers to back this up. And it's not saying don't have kids. That's not what it's saying at all, because if everybody stopped having kids, and all of a sudden the human race would just end. So when we though talk about living a long life, as family size has decreased, it has helped families to be able to have enough to pull themselves out of extreme poverty and give a better life to the children that they have. So there is a relationship between these statistics, and it's also connected to government services and healthcare, right? As healthcare has increased, people are living longer. People also realize, oh, you know what? I don't have to have as many kids because I don't have to be worried about them necessarily dying. So what was the global fertility rate back in 1963?
Five babies per woman.
Again, worldwide average back in 1963. What is the current global fertility rate?
2.5 babies per woman.
And that might not seem like a huge reduction, but to have that cut in half it represents a huge decrease in the rate, the worldwide rate of global population. And again, let's look at this numbers again. What has happened to life expectancy globally since 1963? Again, I don't have it memorized. I don't know the exact number. What did Hans Rosling say? The global average life expectancy, what has happened at least to the life expectancy globally since 1963? Has it gone up? Has it gone down?
It's increased.
And again, we can see that connection as well. We often talk about how the world, sometimes people talk about the good old days and be like, oh, remember back in the day and we didn't care so much about this and people were freer to do this and this, that. Sometimes I think we forget about, often when people are talking about the good old days, we're also talking about times where we didn't have cures to certain diseases and there was actually a lot of increased, like child mortality. And so that's the thing about history. It's important to see where you came from, but it's also important not to dwell too much in the past. That's why actually it's crazy to think about, when people talk about retiring at the age of 65, that's sort of the magic number a lot of times. The reason why people often retired at the age 65 was because on average, they'd be dead by 70. You retire for just a few short years and then you'd be dead. But now, as they say, 60 is the new 50. And if you've ever wondered, like, what does that mean exactly? Can somebody actually define what that means? If somebody says, and it, sometimes they'll say, well, 30 is the new 20, or, 80 is the new 70. You're like, what? That's a weird thing to say. Mathematically, it doesn't make sense. Somebody explain what it means when people are making a comment like that.
I guess this is what I think or what I've heard or whatever. So I think what they mean by when it's like 60 is a new 50, it'd be like if people used to retire more at 50 because they die earlier, then they can retire at 60 instead because they're living longer lives. So they retire at 60 instead.
I think I followed you there for the most part, but it is connected to the idea that people are living longer, right? Yeah. So like it used to be when people, turn 60, it was like, oh, wow, you're old. And now people look at it, you're like, not really. Now turning 60, it's kind of like you're turning 50, right? You still got a lot of life left on average. So when someone says 60 is the new 50, it means that turning a certain age doesn't have the same negative impact that it used to. Many people are healthy and active long into their senior years. And it doesn't mean that there won't be health complications and everything. I mean, I know my dad is in his 60s and he's having all sorts of, knee related issues and all that sort of thing. But at the same time, well, he's also a very interesting person because he's been a phys ed teacher his whole career. He just retired. One of the reasons I got a motorcycle was so I could keep up with him because he on a bike, there's no way that I could catch him because I swear he's a robot. But the thing is, if you look at my dad in his 60s And you compare that to maybe a generation ago, like to have, you know, his own father, my grandfather, you know, in his 60s. We'd say like when you were, you know, a generation ago, you were in your 60s, often there were a lot more health complications. You know, basically you didn't move around all that much. But healthcare and people taking care of themselves and eating well and exercising and lifestyle changes and all those sorts of things mean that people are actually able to live longer, healthier lives on average. Okay, that is something that we are finding. And that isn't just in Canada, that is globally. We find that people are, you know, often when we talk about somebody being, you know, old, often we're thinking, you know, getting into, you know, their 70s and into their 80s and often very much into their 90s. I actually saw something that made me laugh that talked about how old Betty White is. You know, she's pretty famous across the internet, even if you've never seen any of the shows that she was in. You know, it said Betty White is so old that she starred in a show about being old that went off the air before you guys were even born. That's of course referring to the show The Golden Girls, which actually is still a really great TV sitcom from the 80s, which I know even the 80s seem like ancient history for you. But anyway, there you go. Yeah, she's still going. And you've seen probably all of the memes surrounding Queen Elizabeth II, right? That she's immortal, right? The fact that she is, you know, well into her 90s and, you know, shows no signs of slowing down. She is the longest reigning monarch in British history. If we look at the average lifespan of monarchs before her, it was much shorter. I promise we're not going to spend this long on every single question. So 40 years ago, these are some sad numbers. What was the child mortality in Bangladesh?
1 in 5 children die before reaching the age of 5.
1 in 5. That's huge. 20%. That is a terrible number. Okay? And that meant, again, if you looked at the average, because back then, the average was that women were having, you know, 5, 6, 7 kids. So on average, every family was losing at least one child. And so just the mourning and the loss would have been so widespread and so common. If anything, if you were a family that didn't have any kids that died, you would sort of be seen as, you know, the exception. In what areas of development has Bangladesh made vast improvements over the past couple of decades? We kind of already answered this one a little bit before when we were talking about how things have changed for women.
Education.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry, I'm just, oh man, talk about, you know, getting old and everything. I have, well, I have chronic lower back problems and sometimes sitting makes it worse. So I'm just having to move around. Don't worry about me, kids. I'll be fine. But yeah, absolutely. Education and healthcare availability have increased dramatically. And with that, again, we've seen that there are less babies being born, but at the same time, the ones that are being born are surviving. So what's one of the reasons, what's the one major reason for the exponential growth of population over the past century? And again, this is actually good news.
Medical advancement.
I totally agree with you, but that medical advancement, let's build on that because I'll write that down because you're right. Advancement in medicine has greatly reduced. Again, what was the thing that we were just talking about? What have we seen that has gone down dramatically?
Child mortality rates.
Yes. As a result, the people who are born are more likely to live a long life. So really over the past century, you know, sometimes when we look at the increase in global population, sometimes people think it's because, oh, is that because more and more people are having more and more kids? Actually, no, it's not that they're having more and more kids that they've ever had. If anything, we're seeing that the worldwide trends are going down. The reason why and this is when he used the foam blocks to explain it. I think he did a good job with it. He's showing that the reason why that it's projected that, you know, the world will continue to grow in population, again, is because the life expectancy is increasing and child mortality is decreasing. So again, this is going to be a number that's going to show up kind of on your final exam. It's not technically a final exam, but we will be referencing it. By the end of the 21st century, what does Hans Rosling predict will be the world's population?
11 billion.
Yes. And some people, if you look at the trend, if they're like, well, if we have 7 billion, it's going to be 8 billion. Eventually we'll be up to 13, 15, 17, 20 billion people. We won't be able to, this is where he says, calm down, everybody. He's saying 11 billion based on the numbers. He says, what will start to happen with global population after 2100? If we consider the curve of the graph.
Didn't he say it will stay about the same?
Yeah, the curve will basically flatten and remain constant. So by the year 2100 AD, it's projected that our world population will be around 11 billion, and it's actually projected to kind of stay there. And he gives some of the math for why that is going to be the case. And again, what's the main reason population growth will slow and then decline? The global fertility rate has already been reduced. So exponential growth will stop. And it says in the year 2000, how many children 0 to 15 were in the world? I think you gave a nice even number.
2 billion.
2 billion. Now in the year 2100, how many children will there be in the world? I'll give you a hint. It's very similar.
Isn't it 2 billion as well?
Yeah. And this seems kind of strange because it's like, wait a minute, 100 years goes by, you know, and we have to remember in the year 2000, and not that I want to be, you know, sad or cryptic or anything. You know, in the year 2000, you know, these 2 billion children, by the year 2100, not to be, you know, dark or anything, but what's going to happen to these 2 billion people in the year 2100?
They'll all, like 99% of them, like, yeah, 99.9% of them will probably be dead.
Yeah. And so we have to remember, it isn't that we're just stockpiling people. Like over that 100-year span, these, you know, these children will have grown, will have had children of their own, and eventually by the year 2100, will have passed away. And so we have to remember this is the circle of life that we're talking about. When we look at the 2 billion here and 2 billion here, why is this an important statistic? It is known as peak child. the world average is close to 2 babies per woman. And again, the reason why this is important, because if you look at it from a population pyramid standpoint, well, it's saying that, I mean, if you have, and if we're looking at people basically recreating themselves, if the worldwide average is 2 babies born per woman, well, then we have, the genetic information of the male and the female, and they're basically reproducing themselves, right? So then eventually, as those biological parents will grow old and pass away, you'll have 2, copies, so to speak, genetically speaking, that will replace them. And as that cycle continues, it actually keeps the shape of the population pyramid quite stable. You don't really have growth, you have stability. And it's sort of that box shape of the population pyramid. So again, if this is true, why does the world's population still grow? Again, he was bringing this up. He says, if we've already reached peak child, we see the world average has gone down in fertility rate, how come we're still growing? There has to be an answer to it. Why is the world's population still projected to grow, for the next 80 years, even though fertility rate has gone down? I'll highlight this one because I think this is important too. And again, it makes a lot more sense if you watch the video, and I like it when he uses the foam blocks. And again, I see, Kobe's put in the chat, we're expected to live longer. And yeah, that's really what it is. And he said, well, where are these extra billions of people coming from? It's not that women are having more and more babies. It's that as our world population is increasing, the people that are already here are projected to live longer. So rather than people conking out at, 50, 60 years of age, a lot more are expected to live into their 70s, 80s, into their 90s. So again, it's kind of good news in the sense that people are living longer. So it is going to take some time for that to basically even out. People are living longer. Increased life expectancy is explaining why we are projected to still see growth in world population. Over the next 100 years, which continent will see the largest population growth? Continent, not country.
Africa.
And again, he said potentially a doubling and then a doubling again to roughly go from 1 billion to 2 billion and then eventually to 4 billion. And again, because of the worldwide trend of looking at increased services, decreased overall family size, but at the same time then increased life expectancy, to go through that same process and trend, that is the prediction. Now, what percentage of the world's population will be in Africa and Asia by 2100? And this is where he sort of talked about the idea of the pin code of the world. Do you remember that one? Where he's talking about, the Americas, North and South, Europe, Asia. What was the pin code of the world? Do you remember?
I don't remember the PIN code, but I know it was 80% of the world that will live there.
So if I'm not mistaken, I believe you said the pin code of the world was 1145, right? 1 billion in the Americas, 1 billion in Europe, 4 billion in Africa, and 5 billion projected to be remaining in Asia. So again, if we look at that, again, we'd have to do the straight math. But 9 out of 11, is that 80% or so? I can't do the math in my head right this second. I'm embarrassed.
Probably about like approximately.
So there you go. So that's the projection then. So I'm trusting your math on this. This was the pin code of the world. If you have 9 out of 11 billion, roughly 80%. So here's what we're going to do. I'm going to pause the recording for the time being. Okay, so we're back from the break. And so we're not looking so much at just the straight numbers now. We're actually starting to look into some of the more application and strategizing component. So you don't find the answers are not as let's just say you have to think about these answers sometimes a little bit more than just copying down what you hear from the documentary. So I'm really especially interested to hear your thoughts. So given some of these statistics that we've seen, what will be some of the huge challenges in the next 80 years? It's okay and it doesn't have to be directly from this documentary. I mean, we can talk about challenges that that we are facing. So let's list a few of them.
It seems to be the time that we'll have like the least amount of resources, because it seems like this is when there's going to be the most population. So we're going to have a really hard time like sharing those resources.
And this is something that we talked about in the last unit, especially when we were looking at the use of trees and cutting down trees and talking about renewable resources. When you have more than you could ever imagine or need, sometimes you don't really see the point in using things wisely. Sorry, someone has a quick question. Yeah, go ahead.
So when it comes to like resource management, what would you? I know since you're a geography teacher, would you say what? Do you think you could give an example of a country that has not using its resources wisely?
That is not?
That is not, yeah.
Oh, well, I would say most, quite frankly. I'd say that we as a world are much better at exploiting things for profit than we are at using things wisely. So I don't want to pick on specific nations. I mean, Canada and the US as examples, are countries that actually waste an incredible amount and use a great amount of resources per capita. So this is one of the things that was interesting that they were saying in a lot of the poorest countries, because they haven't been as industrialized, they actually don't have as much of a negative impact on the, the environment, because there isn't as much in the way of things like heavy industry. What's interesting is I just saw a statistic, and I mean, they are one of the nations, they are the largest population in the world. But I saw recently that I think it said that China's, emissions have surpassed basically all other countries combined, which is a nightmare. And that's one of the things too. We can say like, oh, China, shame on you for doing all that. But then we also have to look at where our stuff is made. And that's choices we're making too, because it's like, well, those things are made in China. So we're also partially to blame because we keep buying stuff. And so this is going to be a part of the conversation that we have looking into the future. And by the way, I'm not blaming you, but I'm blaming us collectively. I'm saying that sometimes for so long, we've just seen the world as this limitless source of resources. And we thought, oh, there's no way we could ever run out of fish in the sea. There's no way we could ever run out of trees. We could never run out of space. There's just so much of it. Well, we know now that because of increases in technology, we're actually very good at extracting things. And if we're not careful, we may very quickly begin to run out of resources and then run into the problems that, for example, you're seeing in the States right now, people panicking over, gasoline at the pumps. There's actually plenty to go around, but when people start panicking and acting in a certain way that then causes other people to panic, it can actually cause everything to spin out of control. So there's going to be huge challenges finding alternate resources. And again, this stresses the importance of conservation. And again, conservation is basically the wise use of resources. It doesn't mean don't use resources. It means use what you have more wisely. Don't waste. And again, when we look at things like gasoline, just as an example, I was kind of joking about it, and I actually ride it for fun, but I rode my motorcycle to work today. My motorcycle is actually incredibly efficient on gas. I can go over 250 kilometers and it costs me $8 to fill it. And even with the price of gas now, maybe $10. Whereas if you're driving, a massive, Lincoln Navigator, or another, plus size SUV or a big Super Duty truck, then you're finding that, yeah, for you to get from place to place, it is a lot more in the way of use of resources. And I want to be careful here too. I realize that in certain industries and certain businesses, you require certain vehicles in order to do a job. Like if you work in construction, you need a pickup truck. That's how you get stuff around. But and you might say I'm sounding a little preachy here, but I think there are lots of ways in which we as a society kind of flaunt our wealth and, use a lot more than we need to, sometimes just because we can. And I like what Hans Rosling said in the video. Sometimes when we look at the poor nations of the world trying to, pull themselves up, we often say, oh no, don't do that. Otherwise there won't be enough to go around. And then he said, it actually makes a lot more sense to look at it from the other point of view and say, how dare you tell us that we have to live in poverty? What's wrong with us wanting to have the kind of life that you have? You better make changes if you want us to, follow and make changes too. It's not fair for you to just, waste like crazy and live in a certain way. And then when other people say, hey, I want to live like that too, you're like, no, then there won't be enough to go around and you'll destroy the planet. Well, then how come you get to do it? That's actually a very sobering question. Because sometimes you're like, well, because that's the way it's actually a very good question. Yeah, how come I do expect, some people to live in a certain way, and then meaning that I'm just allowed to kind of do whatever I want? What are some of the continued challenges that Mozambique and other countries, face? Extreme poverty is very challenging to combat because it can reproduce itself if it isn't dealt with quickly. Rate, etc. Because again, the studies that we're seeing is that although global poverty has reduced significantly and lots of people have pulled themselves out of poverty, those who are in poverty, it's like they're stuck. It's like they can't get out. You can't just, I saw a stat one time that made me think, it said if hard work made you rich, every mother in Africa would be some of the richest people in the world. Because of the amount of labor. It isn't always hard work that equals riches. I know sometimes we say that. And again, I want to be careful here. Don't go tell your parents, oh yeah, Mr. Seidenberg said I didn't have to work hard. He said it. No, I didn't. What I said is sometimes we have this attitude that says, oh, if you just work hard, you are guaranteed success. But if you're working hard, but you don't have the tools to do the job, you find that you're not actually getting yourself anywhere, right? This is actually where, and I can explain the term work smarter, not harder. And that's not an intelligence thing. It's just saying that, for example, I mean, if I'm looking at, trying to build a fence, if I don't have a power drill, it's going to take me a lot longer to put it together. If I had that one particular tool, I could probably get the job done in 1/10 of the time. And that would save a whole ton of time. In the same way that, for example, how I came to work today, I was able to I have indoor plumbing, so I was able to shower. I have refrigeration, so I was able to, have a nice breakfast and make my coffee and get on my motorcycle and come to Kings. And I didn't have to walk. Like if I had to walk everywhere, if I had to go to, the local stream in order to get myself a drink of water, I wouldn't have the time to do anything else. I'd just be spending all my time trying to survive. And that's actually really what we're finding in a lot of places in the world where there is no infrastructure and where there is extreme poverty. Extreme poverty begets extreme poverty, right? It's like it continually reproduces itself. And this sort of looks into how is a bicycle important to rural people in Mozambique? We think of a bicycle as just as something like a toy. What's the usefulness of the bicycle to, that family in rural Mozambique in the video? How does it help the family situation?
I think he said like it's just like better than walking, and especially when like those poor people like can't afford cars.
So it's true that it's faster, absolutely, but so just faster for the sake of being faster, what does that faster transportation, what are some of the things that helps to do? So for the one, it's for business, right? Get faster to market and can carry more. What else?
Yeah.
What else can it be good for that they mentioned in the video?
I think I don't. I think I wrote like faster. Yeah. I also basically wrote can carry more, and then it was like more efficient than walking, obviously. Or yeah, that's all I really had.
Well, and I agree with you, right? But that speed also helps them for quicker access to medical attention. If they needed a doctor instead of trying to run and get a doctor, it's quicker there too. It also allows time to be able to educate themselves and get themselves to classes where they learn, basic, math and, various other things to help protect themselves from being taken advantage of people. And that's actually going to be a question a little bit later on. How much do the world's poorest billion on Earth make per day? The extreme poverty calculation that he used, looking at the world's billion. So basically took, the 7 billion people and the 7 billion, from richest to poorest, and how much on average do the world's poorest billion on Earth make per day? Did everybody turn off the documentary at this point? Well, why don't we start with this one then? How much do the world's richest billion on Earth make per day?
About $100.
Now, again, we have to put this into context because especially if we look at, where we live, living in Toronto, the Greater Toronto area, living in Canada, for people who are making, $100 a day, which would wind up being, even if it was 7 days a week, $700 a week, which winds up being, roughly almost $3,000 a month, which would basically be, $36,000 a year. That is not a lot of money. Okay, that is someone making under $40,000 a year, or a family making under $40,000 a year in the Greater Toronto Area is going to have considerable money challenges and scarcity, right? If we look at, having to have, food and clothing and rent and all those sorts of things, that's going to be eaten up very quickly. But at the same time, just to put that into context for the entire world's population, it's crazy to think that looking around the entire world, even someone who is wondering how they're going to make ends meet, living in the Greater Toronto, just the fact that you're in Canada and have access to healthcare services and the kind of infrastructure that we have puts you in the world's richest billion, which is humbling. And again, it's important that we don't turn a blind eye to poverty in our communities. We don't want to say to people who are struggling, especially, because there is real poverty that exists in North America and in Canada, in our backyard. We don't want to look at people who are struggling in poverty and be like, well, you know what? Some people in the world have it way worse. So, just smile and don't worry about it. When we look at the amount of money and what can be bought and purchasing power, it's not as simplistic as he describes. But at the same time, if we look at how much of the world's poorest billion, didn't he say it's like $1.25, around $1, something along those lines? Is it less than $1 a day, something like that?
Yeah, I think that was about what they said, or he said. Yeah.
So again, if we're looking at that, right, from the world's poorest billion to the world's richest billion, like we see that this is a 100-fold difference, right? And so, and I think he made a good point though, when he was saying sometimes we as the world's richest billion, we look down on the rest of the world and everybody looks equally poor. Whereas for someone who is making, $10 a day versus $1 a day, it looks a lot different. And so again, I don't want to get too much into the math here and wondering about how we calculate this, but it is important to talk about how, and again, when we look at wealth and we look at gratitude and we look at hope, yes, we are living in a pandemic where we experience challenges. Yes, we have real challenges, and it's important to be able to talk and share about those things. I'm not diminishing them. But at the same time, we have to realize that a lot of the challenges that we are facing right now, if we talk about, things like being bored and school anxiety and those sorts of things, I would say by and large, though, the most of us still have electricity. We still have food to eat. We still, for the most part, have Wi-Fi. So I'm not diminishing the real things that we do experience. They are real challenges, and we want to support and love one another through them. But having some global perspective, to think about the fact that we don't have to walk, multiple miles in order to find a well in the hopes of getting fresh water just so that we can have a drink. Right? If anything, we're going to be talking about this, the amount of water that we as Canadians waste on average is quite incredible. There are some studies that have said that on average, the water that is in the toilets in North American homes is cleaner than a lot of the water that people drink around the world. And I know that grosses you out. You're like, ew, I can't even imagine. Well, again, if you haven't really seen extreme poverty, it's hard to really grasp the real challenges that people in the world face. And so becoming aware of it is a really important part of being what we call a global citizen, right? And thinking beyond our own borders. So the Lord detests dishonest scales, but accurate weights find favor with him. How does this verse apply to Andre and his wife? Well, looking at this, sometimes people try to take advantage of some of the poorest people. It is easier to cheat people who are not wealthy and powerful. And that's one of the biggest issues that we have too. Sometimes when we talk about, you know, bad things that happen to people in the world, and we're like, we don't even hear about it. Why? Well, because they don't have Instagram accounts. And, you know, like it does kind of make me sick a little bit. I know I sound like a grumpy old man, but sometimes the sort of things that make it into the way of news where you hear about people like, I don't know. Well, again, like, and I have no time for them, but you hear about like Caitlyn Jenner and it's like, oh, you know, she's sad because something happened or whatever. And you're just like, how is this news? Honestly, how is this news?
Or then, or sorry to cut you off, but like, but then you have like news, like I saw on CB24 about like a bombing in like Israel where like 67 people died and there were like 17 children that died. And like, you know, I feel like that's more important than like, you know, what you were talking about, like the Caitlyn, like that kind of thing of like, you know,
And it
like
becomes what we fill our minds with, you know, like as the old saying goes, is actually from a Dr. Seuss book, you know, and he was talking about the Lorax, you know, and looking at the idea of making the world a better place. And basically, you know, towards the end of that story, if you're familiar with it, you know, it basically says, unless people like you know, collectively and individually start caring about these sorts of things, then things aren't ever going to get better. And I'm not blaming you for the world's problems, but I am trying to encourage you and say that you are going to be the generation that is going to be here long after I'm gone, right? Because I'm not going to be here forever. So if we want the world to get better, then it is going to be a lot of the task of the younger generation that is going to be here and is going to be making decisions, and you're going to be the doctors and lawyers and teachers and entrepreneurs and accountants and athletes, you know, of the future. It's important that part of your upbringing is learning that there's an entire world out there of people who are looking for a better life. They're not looking for a handout, right? They're not looking for you to send them money. They're looking for us to try to craft a world in which we take care of the planet that we have, that we manage the resources we have effectively, so that there can be things like fair trade and fair treatment. And so this is a kind of a kickstart to some of the content we're going to be continuing to look at in our human geography unit. And so the good news is, if I'm not mistaken, I might be wrong with this number. What percentage of the world's population are literate, can read and write? Does anybody recall from the documentary? I have a number in my head that I think it is.
%80?
Okay, good. I was going to say, I feel like it's over 80%. So I'm going to say over. So over 80%. So that's a good start, because sometimes when we think of illiteracy and poverty, you know, we think that number might be a lot higher, but we're making some goals here. We're making some advancements. What is going to be the new UN development goal? To eradicate extreme poverty. And what is one of the biggest threats to this goal? Apathy, which means people not caring. Selfishness. Also connected to people not caring. How much of the total global CO2 does the richest billion emit? Over 50%. How much CO2 does the poorest billion emit? I forget, but it's a very small number. What is often the hypocrisy of the richest billion when it comes to increased CO2 emissions? And I mentioned this before, the idea of we tell others don't live like us. Don't lie like us. That too, maybe. Don't live like us. What is going to be required for the future to be good for all people of the earth? It is going to require teamwork. Okay, it's not going to be the goal of a specific person or even a specific country, right? If we want to have a good future for all people, we need to believe A, that it's possible, and then B, we need to be willing to work towards it. So here's actually what I'm going to be doing in the interest of the time that we have remaining. I'm not going to dig in to a new topic today. I'm actually going to stop the recording.